So hi everyone, thanks very much for coming to this seminar from the Centre for Gender Studies at Lancaster University. My name's Laura Clancy, I'm the co-director of the centre. So we usually do about 3 times a term, different seminars with different guest speakers coming in. We are recording this, just to let you know, that it will go on our YouTube. So for anyone who didn't get a chance to come, you might want to pass that on. We also have one more session coming up in a couple of weeks, I think. The final one for this term in this series, so you might want to book onto that if you're interested. Our usual practice is if everyone could mute themselves in the audience, just because there's sometimes an echo and it's a bit distracting. And we'll keep that throughout. And then at the end, we'll leave time for questions and conversation towards the end of the session. So we're really pleased to be joined today by Aleena Din. So Aleena is a researcher in the Humanities Division at the University of Oxford. Her doctoral research is an oral history project on the migration, settlement and work experiences of British-Pakistani women between 1962 and 2002. And she's currently a researcher for a project on the long history of race, resistance and belonging at the University of Oxford, which will culminate in an edited volume and digital resources. So thank you so much, Aleena.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura, and thank you for the invitation. It's really lovely to be here. So I will just get started so that there's lots of opportunity for questions at the end. So in this paper, I hope to do 3 things. Firstly, outline the origins and design of an oral history project about working class British Pakistani women and their labour experiences. Secondly, reveal the types of work my interviewees engaged with, and finally argue that these experiences have the potential to complicate definitions of work, which are often related to the money economy. I'll end this paper with a case study to highlight the varying ways in which the women I interviewed chose to answer the following question: did you work? And just to preface this case study that I will be talking about at the end by no means encompasses the variety of work women engage with. So if you have any questions about other examples that emerge from my doctoral thesis, please do ask them at the end of the paper. So I want to begin with an overview of the project in terms of its aims and design. The project is a comparative study about British Pakistani women's experiences of formal and informal labour between 1962 and 2002. And this study is the first comprehensive historical account about British Pakistanis, and specifically British Kashmiri women in this period, and is part of a growing but deeply limited historiography about South Asian women in Britain. The oral testimony of 29 migrant and second-generation British Pakistani women who lived in Middlesbrough and Oldham is central to this research. The period begins with the enactment of the first Commonwealth Immigration Act of 1962. The legislation to regulate migrant influx catalysed migrant men's decision regarding whether they would live in Britain permanently. Men from across the Indian subcontinent migrated after the Second World War to work in British mills, factories and foundries, primarily earning money to send remittance back to Pakistan. For many, their settlement in Britain was temporary because before 1962, circular migration was possible. However, many Pakistani men arranged for the relocation of wives and children as a response to the restrictions placed on migrant mobility by the government, driven by the fear that additional laws would prevent families from reuniting. The period ends in 2002 with the implementation of the Nationality, Immigration and Asylum Act. The Life in the United Kingdom test, which was proposed as part of the Act, became central to British immigration policy after 2002. Irrevocably changing how citizenry was decided, given the emphasis placed on testing applicants' English proficiency and general knowledge. Now, had the test been implemented before 2002, many of my interviewees would not be British citizens, given that the vast majority could not read and write in English, and they were often pulled from education as children, meaning that some women were illiterate in their own languages. These 2 legislative turning points marked 40 years of women migrating from Pakistan to Oldham and Middlesbrough. Where women settled, the attitudes of family members towards wage work, changes in their local job market, their ability to access education classes, and the communities they became part of all affected women's work choices and everyday activity. Britain is home to the world's largest community of overseas Pakistanis, and over 70% of British Pakistanis, as well as the majority of my interviewees, migrated from the villages surrounding Middlesbrough, a small district on the edges of Azad Kashmir, and they were often part of Pakistan's exploited rural labouring classes. Oldham has one of the largest populations of Kashmiri Pakistanis in the UK. It was an attractive place for single migrant Middlesbrough men to find decently paying work, which was unavailable in their neglected villages. The town, which is known for its cotton spinning, offered opportunities for work in the local mills in the aftermath of the Second World War. Employers sought labourers that could be paid a menial wage and would take on the jobs white workers had refused. And like Oldham, Middlesbrough has quite a large Middlesbrough community. A hub of steel manufacturing, the need to remedy post-war labour shortages motivated employers from factories such as Dorman Long and later British Steel to look to South Asia. When men invited their families to join them after 1962, women and their children had to settle in towns rarely of their choosing, navigating places that were vastly different from the villages they had left behind in Pakistan. Women's economic participation was not a priority when places of settlement were chosen. Rather, men's work opportunities determined where families lived. So in trying to understand the settlement experiences of British Pakistani women, why use work as a starting point of historical analysis? Well, the reasons for this are important and varied. I knew from my own personal experiences that women from my community, which is Middlesbrough's British Pakistani community, had always engaged in various forms of labour, including growing vegetables to sell at the local greengrocers, or offering free daily Islamic classes to children in the area. However, according to Anthony Heath and Yao Jun Lee, between 1972 and 2005, Pakistani and Bangladeshi women were consistently the least economically active group in the UK. The rate of economic activity amongst Pakistani women aged 19 to 60 between 2001 and 2005 was 31%, compared to 77% amongst white women. The rate of Pakistani women who are economically active but unemployed is also significant. For example, 15% of economically active British Pakistani women were unemployed between 2001 and 2005, compared to 3.4% of white women. High levels of poverty amongst British Pakistanis affected their disadvantaged position within the labour market. In 2017, 37% of British Pakistanis lived in poverty, compared to 13% of the population belonging to white groups. Moreover, in 2017, the average income for a Pakistani household was £8,700 lower than their white counterparts. Analysing British Pakistani women's settlement experiences in Middlesbrough and Oldham highlighted that the government's focus on formal wage work as a determinant of economic activity undermines the breadth of women's work, whether they're migrant or not. For migrant women in particular, their participation in formal wage work has been used to gauge their willingness to integrate into British society. For example, in 2016, the Conservative government-sponsored study titled Review into Opportunity and Integration was released and chaired by Dame Louise Casey. In the review, Muslim Pakistani and Bangladeshi women were described as the most economically inactive group in the UK, and it was suggested that their lack of participation in formal wage work was an integration that they had not integrated into British society. Whilst formal wage work was not a common experience amongst my interviewees, women worked in varying and important ways, from self-employment to structured voluntary work, often to ensure they, their families and community members had a more comfortable long-term settlement. Given the reasons underpinning the state's collection of information regarding economic activity, such as the management of workers and taxation, it's not necessarily surprising that the invisible or casual work women regularly undertake is rarely accounted for in studies such as the Review into Opportunity and Integration. Instead, activists and researchers have been responsible for recording migrant women's work experiences. Pat Lewis and Rabia Patel, in their 1987 study on Black and South Asian women's work experiences, argued that a high proportion of their Muslim respondents from South Asia worked, despite official statistics that suggested otherwise. Amongst their 28 interviewees was a young British South Asian woman who was the eldest of 7 children. She said to Lewis and Patel that she worked because, quote, "You can't expect him," meaning her father, "to feed us all on age." Precisely these debates about whether British Pakistani worked and how work is defined that necessitated further historical inquiry. Despite the statistical significance of British Pakistani women's economic inactivity, There's been little research into why Pakistani women were less likely to be formal wage workers, beyond some key sociological or anthropological studies. The first of these studies was published in 1979. The anthropologist Muhammad Anwar was concerned with analysing, quote, how far Pakistanis as an ethnic group are transplanting their culture to this country, in particular to illustrate how sponsorship and patronage result in friendship and kinship networks being re-established in Britain. However, Anwar largely ignored women's experiences. On the theme of work, for example, Anwar argued that, quote, the majority of Muslims do not allow their wives and daughters to work or have contact with the outside world. Where women are mentioned in this study, burda, which means veiling as a practice of female seclusion, was the overwhelming focus, rather than their testimony of making home in a new place, creating community networks, and navigating their local labour market. Contrastingly, however, the anthropologist Alison Shaw, in her study of the Pakistani community in Oxford, published in 1988, made a more concerted effort to use gender as a framework of analysis. Notably, Shaw argued that the trope of Pakistani women being subordinate, passive victims of patriarchy presents a wholly negative impression of Pakistani women's role. This was a direct critique to the growing orthodoxy within the social sciences to analyse Pakistani women's experiences primarily in relation to burda or veiling. Although they were briefly mentioned in this study, the women Shaw interviewed have far more complicated roles in their families and communities, often exerting power in the areas where they had responsibilities, such as the day-to-day management of their households. My study, the first historical account of Pakistani women's migration and settlement since the mid-20th century, takes a different approach to the existing limited scholarship about the British-Pakistani community. Most importantly, this project foregrounds women's personal testimonies of migration and settlement in Middlesbrough and Oldham to illuminate the breadth of their labour, rather than relying on the state's insufficient framework of economic activity or the testimony of Pakistani men. As the activist and writer Pratibha Palmer argued, it is crucial to challenge the narrative of South Asian women as passive sufferers of oppression, and instead analyse the ways in which women navigated and resisted institutional racism, sexism, and economic exploitation. A life history approach to oral history gave women the space to share an expansive account of their migration and settlement experiences. I interviewed 29 women who settled in Britain between the 1950s until the late 1990s and had spent a significant part of their lives either in Middlesbrough or Oldham. Some women were part of the first pioneer generation of British Pakistanis to arrive from the late 1950s until the 1970s. 15 interviewees fit into this category, and they all migrated to join men who were already settled in Britain, and this was most often their husbands or fiancés. They remembered small developing communities of Pakistanis who helped one another in the absence of council or government-led initiatives to support them as non-English speakers. They had to build new networks of support through community relationships and develop skills that were integral to a more comfortable settlement. Memories of loneliness, fear, isolation, and in some cases depression marked the early part of their settlement. I also interviewed a wave of migrant women who arrived during the late 1980s and 1990s. These women were part of a younger cohort of women who often married the children of first-generation migrants or married straight after their migration. They had access to adult education classes as well as community centres established by British South Asians. Much like older migrant women, their migration was predicated on where their husbands lived. In addition, and similarly to older women, some used their skills to enrich community life in the towns they found themselves, community life in their towns, or found themselves in desperate economic situations that required them to find work in competitive job markets. Many had to manage this with the responsibilities of childcare and housework. And finally, I interviewed 11 women who migrated as children or were born in the UK during the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. These women benefited from compulsory education until age 16, which far surpassed the quality of state education women born in Pakistan had access to. Their aspirations regarding work, education, marriage, and motherhood pointed to significant shifts in expectations along generational lines. Factors such as the ability to speak English fluently and the national rise of married women and mothers entering the workforce were in part responsible for this change. Not only could second generation women reflect on their mother's work through their childhood memories, They also offered rich insights into how and why their lives were similar or different to migrant women who arrived to the UK as adults. To analyse British-Pakistani women's experiences of migration, settlement and work experiences, I decided to centre these women's testimony by using oral history as the primary methodology. Meeting women was made easier by my status as a British-Pakistani, a Muslim woman from a working class background. I could access women's homes and community centres with relative ease, and my background may have made it easier for women to share their experiences of child marriage, puberty and discrimination if they wanted to, since having these conversations with men, Pakistani or not, is often deemed inappropriate. However, despite my status, the generational differences between my interviewees and I, as well as the acute lack of historical research pertaining to British-Pakistani women's labour experiences, resulted in new themes of research emerging during the interviewing process. It was therefore necessary to be flexible with the questions I asked and adapt the project's aims to reflect new ideas. Now, since women were sharing experiences about their labour that had not yet been considered an existing scholarship, it was necessary to interview a variety of women to better understand change across time, between places and generations. In Middlesbrough, my personal connections to the British-Pakistani community were used as a starting point to find interviewees who had migrated from the 1950s until the 1970s. It became apparent that there was an established community understanding of which women first settled in Middlesbrough and the work that they did. In Oldham, however, I did not benefit from being part of the local Pakistani community, so community centres became the places where I met interviewees, such as an elderly women's group at a women's community centre that I visited in 2018. Developing a relationship with community activists was crucial in building connections with potential interviewees. And practically speaking, it was common to interview women either in group settings or with family members, friends, and carers present. For some older women, immobility or disability meant that interviews had to take place in shared spaces. But from these group interviews emerged an unexpected dynamic. Remembering became a collective process, with women learning from each other, comparing memories, and powerfully demonstrating the close relationships they had with one another. The overlap and divergences in their experiences of labour highlighted the significance of age, status, generation, and place in determining how women's settlement processes unfolded. Self-employment, structured but unpaid labour, casual voluntary labour, home-based employment, wage labour, and unpaid domestic care were the types of work I encountered during the interviewing process, a large swathe of categories that reflect the complicated, diverse forms of everyday activity women participated in. Despite the meaningful and important ways in which women contributed their time, effort, and skills to support their community's long-term settlement, women often associated the term work solely with waged employment. Now, this raises a fundamental question. What does work mean? The Punjabi term for work, gum, is used interchangeably to mean waged work, self-employment, and unpaid housework and childcare. At times, I chose not to qualify the term gum or work with my own definitions when I asked the question, did you work? And instead allowed my interviewees to define what work meant to them. This decision resulted in interviewees consistently interpreting this question as a reference to formal waged work, rather than voluntary or unpaid labour. In most interviews, I also asked this question, "To sabar ne kam karne so," which literally means, did you work outside? This is a typical way of asking an individual about their formal employment or self-employment in Punjabi, the insinuation being that earning money happened outside the home. This question often came later in the conversation, when women had spent some time reflecting on their day-to-day activities. Asking about outside work was often an attempt to specifically understand how employment, self-employment, or formalised voluntary work fit into the matrix of domestic responsibilities women were more likely to discuss with me at length. Often, despite asking, did you work, or even asking, did you work outside, it was in passing, when women discussed community relationships or everyday activities, that they referred to any form of non-domestic work. The interviews revealed that there was a commonly accepted definition of work, which was rooted in the idea that work is performed in a regimentally managed, time-controlled environment. This was the way their husbands and sons worked. Breadwinners who left the home, worked a set number of hours, and were paid at the end of the month. A historian of colonial Bengal, Shomita Sen, argued that the separation of the home and workplace eroded the integrity of the household in Western Europe, as it became associated with leisure. This contrasts with her case study of Bengal, where, during the process of industrialization of the mid-19th century, the home remained a site of combined domestic and wage-earning labour for poorer women. Many work to define their own labour activities, instead characterising their services or home-based employment as forms of leisure that were separate from work. This meant that practices such as running community-based money-saving circles or managing household resources were not included in their testimony about economic participation. Women's paid work was determined in large part by the other demands on their time, as mothers, wives, and community members. On the theme of women's paid and unpaid work, for example, the sociologist Parminder Bachu considered how responsibilities at home affected women's work experiences by focusing on the testimony of British Sikh women. Whilst Bachu was careful not to equate waged work with liberation, she argued that having access to money meant Sikh women could, quote, invest and consume in their own interests and for their own benefit. Bachu was the first scholar to consider the consequences of British South Asian women using their wages to improve their settlement experiences. In relation to generational change, Bachu argued that younger Sikh women were more likely to be in professional work compared to their mothers, and whilst younger women still did most of the housework, they were in a better position to negotiate how their household was managed. Generational change and the rise of women in professional work meant younger women earned more, and therefore could exert more power in their household compared to an old generation. For several interviewees, the inability to work outside the home for various reasons meant home became the site of paid work. Moreover, it meant that some women chose not to work for a wage, instead opting for voluntary work, which had a moralizing effect, such as teaching the Quran. This was often regular, structured, and took place within the home. Arguably, despite being unpaid, voluntary labour was work. Women's broad labour experiences, as Claire Langhammer argued, quote, offers a fundamental challenge to definitions of leisure, which assume an oppositional relationship to paid labour. Historical context is crucial in defining work and leisure, concepts which are flexible and subject to change. Leisure and work were, for the vast majority of my interviewees, interconnected experiences because formal wage work was particularly inaccessible to working class Pakistani women. Racist employment practices and dangerous stereotyping meant that British South Asians were often regarded as uneducated and incapable. In addition, the creation of long-term local Pakistani communities meant creating services specifically for women that supported a more comfortable settlement, such as sewing traditional South Asian wear, salwar kameez, or free letter writing services offered by women in the community, so that illiterate women did not lose contact with their loved ones in Pakistan. These combined pressures resulted in women using their skills to offer largely voluntary community services for other Pakistani women, and they often operated these services from their homes. Whilst there's been little historical exploration of British South Asian women's migration and settlement experiences, sociologists have debated the extent to which men's attitudes towards women's work and veiling has affected British Pakistani and British Bangladeshi women's lower formal labour participation rate. Early scholarship from the 1970s, most notably by Amrit Wilson, suggested that South Asian women's isolation was the result of, quote, being forced to stay at home for cultural reasons, and that practices of honour killing and shame have stopped women from participating in work outside the home. However, by the late 1980s and 1990s, sociologists such as Aftar Bra argued that the idea of men preventing women from working was by itself insufficient in understanding South Asian women's work experiences, given the implications of regional variation, the class position of women before their migration, generational change, and local job markets in determining whether women worked. In other words, childhood experiences before migration, local social and economic change, the demand to undertake unpaid work, racist and sexist hiring practices, and patriarchal control affected British South Asian women's experiences of work outside the home. So knowing all this, how then can work be defined in order to encompass the breadth of experiences women shared when asked about formal and informal labour across their life cycles? I argue that work is a purposeful application of skill to processes which result in material or intangible outcomes. In other words, quantifying the value of labour in relation to the money economy is both inadequate and limiting. The consequences of women applying skills that had a moralising effect, such as free Islamic education classes, or emotional significance, such as women becoming voluntary translators for their newly arrived community members, are forms of labour which are more structured, organised, and skills-based than typical leisure activities. To account for these experiences, the definition of work must be more expansive and encompassing. So now that I've shared context about the project, where my findings sit in relation to other scholarship and how I choose to define work, I want to end with a case study to discuss together and to exemplify why definitions of work must be interrogated by historians. So in late 2018, I met a woman named Sardar, who lived in an affluent middle-class neighbourhood on the outskirts of Middlesbrough. Sardar was an elderly woman. She didn't know her real age, which was a common phenomenon amongst many of my interviewees, but she could offer one concrete piece of numerical information, that she migrated with her 3 children from Middlesbrough to Middlesbrough in the winter of 1972 to join her husband, who had migrated a few years earlier to work for British Steel. Sardar arrived during a period of growing economic turbulence in Middlesbrough. From the late 1970s until the 1990s, Teesside had one of the highest rates of unemployment in Britain as a result of deindustrialisation. In addition, women's unemployment in Middlesbrough has consistently been higher than the national average, given the dominance of a declining steel industry, which offered few employment opportunities to women outside of being clerks or assistants. For Sardar, who was pulled out of education as a child to marry and was therefore unable to read or write in Urdu, the notion of undertaking this type of professional work seemed near impossible. In addition, given her husband's long hours and a lack of affordable childcare, Sardar felt compelled to stay at home and take care of her growing family. Self-employment and home-based work then became the only way she could earn an income. Now, self-employment was very popular amongst my interviewees in Middlesbrough, more so than in Oldham, where almost all my interviewees were employed by textile corporations to undertake home-based clothes manufacturing for a menial wage, or in other words, homeworking. The reason why women became self-employed was varied. For some women, self-employment was not necessarily motivated by the need to supplement the household income, rather was a way to relieve boredom and earn money to buy toys and clothes. For others, their self-employment was a response to unexpected changes in their lives, such as becoming single mothers, which meant that they became solely responsible for making ends meet. Many women I interviewed, like Sardar, chose self-employment because its flexibility allowed them to make their own money, whilst also being able to take care of their families. Soon after her migration, Sardar decided to grow specialty vegetables in her garden and sell them to the local South Asian grocers called furries. She implied that her decision was a response to 3 different dilemmas: the lack of work available to all women in Middlesbrough, the non-existent social or economic infrastructure to support long-term Pakistani settlement, and the responsibilities placed on women to take care of their families. In Sardar's case, she had to be self-employed or not work at all, since she did not consider putting her children into expensive childcare and didn't know whether she was entitled to any welfare payments. She only applied for family allowance when her 4th child was born, soon after her migration. She said, quote, "My eldest daughter used to go to school at the time. My son was 13 or 14 when we came here. We were entitled to money, but my husband was simple and my son, he was educated, but he didn't know the law. So I didn't get family allowance for my children. I only found out when my 4th child was born." This was in part why Sardar decided to earn an income by profiting from the sales of her vegetables, since she did not always see the state as a source of support. Sardar was able to support her community by growing vegetables because of the labour she participated in before her migration. In Pakistan, she was responsible for growing vegetables that her husband would sell at the market. Despite this, when I asked if she had ever had a job, her answer was no. It was a surprise then to hear her casually describe self-employment further on in our conversation, remembering at length a job that by any definition would constitute formal work. In her opinion, however, this was not the case. She said, "When I moved to Watchley Road, I started doing the gardening. I never used to go to women's houses except for Furry's shop. Everyone used to come to Furry's shop. Everyone used to become a friend. So I had a garden with spinach, fenugreek. I used to grow everything. Everyone around used to come and sit with me. I had the garden and stayed with Furry, and everyone I spoke to, even my son, used to tell his teacher, my mum is working. And when they asked me, I used to say, you can call it what you want. I have my own meaning. If I sit and chat with women or misplace a radish, for example, I do it by myself, for myself. Her reluctance to call her work a real job was striking. Whilst I'd heard this remark before by women who believed that unpaid services could not constitute a job, Sardar's work was a consistent form of income. Its unstructured nature, however, was the part she believed rendered this work a hobby of sorts, not a job. The use of her time was flexible, and she had control, a vastly different working experience compared to her husband. He was an employee of British Steel, meaning his work hours were strictly defined by his employer, and his day was divided between his employer's time, where his labour could not be wasted, and his own time after work and on weekends. The result of managing domestic responsibility with working from home was the dilution of women's self-conception as income earners. In Sardar's case, it was telling that throughout our interview, domestic life dominated her story, even when I presented opportunities to talk about her job. She described her life as a mother of four, often reverting to her family life at various points of the interview, even when I asked about income earning work. It was clear that in her testimony, her family was her priority. It's important to note that when Sardar began working in the 1970s, it was only starting to become more commonplace for mothers to be present in the workplace. An older generation of self-employed interviewees were part of mothers in Britain. By 1977, 70% of all wage-earning mothers worked part-time. It's important to question, however, which types of women make up this statistic. For example, according to Sardar, none of the women she knew formally worked. She laughed and dismissed the idea that women from the Pakistani community were ever formally employed. Evidently, however, far more participated in casual wage or income earning work, labour that has often remained invisible. When equal rights and pay equity dominated the debate around women's work in the 1970s, with the Equal Pay Act or the Sex Discrimination Act, for example, Pakistani women in Middlesbrough were yet to take steps into seemingly inaccessible formal workspaces. It is clear then why Sardar could not call her self-employment work. Work was what men did in her community, or her white counterparts did, not her. Women of her generation living in Middlesbrough, she suggested, could not envisage being employees, nor did these opportunities necessarily present themselves. So to conclude, I argue that work is the purposeful application of skill to processes which result in material or intangible outcomes. Quantifying the value of labour in relation to the money economy is inadequate, particularly in the case of working class British Pakistani women's experiences of labour. The interconnected nature of women's responsibilities resulted in interviewees often undertaking various types of work as part of their daily activity. Whilst formal wage labour in a workplace was not the most cited form of work, women explained why this was the case for them, in turn illuminating forms of labour which have been integral to the settlement of thousands of Pakistanis in Britain. In addition, asking women to discuss their everyday lives highlighted the significant yet overlooked relationship between class, race, gender, place, and generation, which affected women's work choices. Work, as a starting point of historical analysis, revealed a rich history of women's changing attitudes, their aspirations for work and education, their expectations of life in Britain, and their hopes for a future generation who would call Britain home. These experiences extended far beyond women's relationship with the labour market. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aleena. That was fascinating. I think loads for us to discuss there, hopefully. Anyone with any questions, you can either put your hand up and come on the mic, or feel free to write them in the chat if you prefer. I can see a couple of people typing. Isabel, put your hand up.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Hi, Aleena. Thanks so much for sharing your project. It was so interesting. My research actually looks at lived experience of British working class women's unpaid domestic work. So I'm buzzing with questions. It's really exciting to hear someone speak, someone who's also obsessed with work. It's really good. And so I'm really interested in the geographical like positioning of your project, particularly how it relates to the kinds of work like community volunteering that you were saying some of your interviewees were engaged in. So I wondered what for you are the like main reasons and the kind of significance of doing this sort of research in towns and northern towns particularly, rather than say cities, and sort of southern cities, specifically like London.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Isabel. In terms of geography, there was a lot to consider, particularly after the pandemic. So originally the project was designed to decentre away from places that had already been quite heavily focused on in terms of South Asian migration and settlement. So places like Bradford, for example. So I wanted to look at places that had not necessarily been researched particularly heavily. I'm from Middlesbrough. It seemed natural to start with Middlesbrough. And then Oldham seemed like a good point of comparison because their local economies are so vastly different. So what does it mean for a woman or a community to settle in a place where steel dominated versus somewhere where the textile industry was a key source of employment? I mean, there's a long history in Britain of women being associated with textile work. So in some ways, it was contributing to that body of scholarship of what it means for a town to go through deindustrialization and then for women, particularly migrant women, to undertake homeworking. Originally, the project was designed to also compare to cities in the south. So Luton was one of them. I began research there just before the pandemic, and it became apparent that it was going to be pretty difficult to continue that line of research, given the fact that I was based in the Northeast I've been for the past couple of years. So I sort of had to make a decision to change the design of the project. Actually, it worked out for the better. I sort of realized that because these histories and the histories of these areas, local history, was so under-researched that I would maybe be doing a disservice to expand my project in the way that I hoped. That actually focusing on these two places and using these as points of comparison was revealing so much that it was, I guess, worth just focusing on these two places that happen to be in the north. Now, Northern history as well, in the body of scholarship related to modern British history, particularly after 1945, is quite limited. So again, I knew I was contributing to something that has maybe been under research, particularly in relation to women and work. And I think this idea of localizing women's history to a specific place to understand the complexities of local social and economic change, and maybe how that relates to more broad change across the UK. I thought that was a really important point of inquiry. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Thank you.
It seems incredible, really, doesn't it, that the North is still under research, because it's such a like you say, it's such a different context. Even in, I mean, one thing that stood out to me when you were talking, I thought was interesting, was these women who said they didn't realise they could get these different types of benefits, and they'd missed out on it. So even in terms of, I guess, like council provision or community provision and stuff, and how that might differ geographically, I think is really interesting, and that's why it's so important to change the geography.
Yeah, and it revealed so much about the ways, what's emphasized in different local histories. So looking at the archive in Middlesbrough versus Oldham was such a revealing experience, where Oldham, for example, has had really turbulent recent history to do with racial violence and white supremacy. Not to say that didn't exist in Middlesbrough, but the archive prioritized that kind of information or organized it so that it was accessible for historians. The underfunding of archives here in Middlesbrough meant that it was almost impossible to find that kind of information. So in that sense, it was revealing to see what local councils were prioritizing in terms of documenting their local history, and also the real differences in how local histories are funded in different areas. That was so revealing as well. It made my job a lot harder sometimes.
Yeah, it did. Another layer for you to think about.
Yeah.
Nadia, I hope I said your name right.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Aleena. That's a wonderful, really good presentation. And I do think there is a need to kind of acknowledge the diversity within the South Asian community and South Asian women, which we don't find very much. I mean, the authors you mentioned who are sort of the canon on this is like Amrit Wilson, After Bra, but they talk about more of the South Asian experience. So I'm really glad that you did this research, and I'm really glad that this data will be available to us. I am currently looking at Bangladeshi women and their participation in British politics. And as part of that, I'm also looking at women's participation, especially Muslim women's participation in the labour market. And your work definitely is going to be very useful. I think there's already a comment in the chat that when are you publishing on this so that we can all read it and use it for our work. I was wondering, when you were speaking to your women, whether you sort of, if they made any references to this diversity, so the religious and cultural diversity within South Asian women, and whether you felt that had, or that gave them differential access to how, what they called work, or what is commonly known as work, as in the waged labor. Because, I mean, like yours, a lot of Bangladeshi women has been doing this homework for a very, very long time, and they continue to do it. I mean, all my clothes get altered by women who are still working from home at piecemeal rate. So I was wondering whether you thought that those regional or religious or, you know, cultural differences within South Asia is something that they acknowledged.
That's a great question. Thank you. So when I was designing this project, I was quite purposeful in making sure that almost everyone I interviewed was from Middlesbrough, that there was a specificity in where they came from, mostly because, as you rightly acknowledge, women's experiences across South Asia, across Pakistan, vary significantly. Kashmir is was for a period of time significantly underdeveloped. Now it's one of the wealthiest areas of Pakistan because remittance is sent. It's a history project in and of itself. Whereas when you go to interview women from cities such as Lahore or Jhelum, there's a type of educational experience or a type of access to different forms of work before migration that mean that experiences are just not necessarily comparable with the women I interviewed. And I did interview some women from Jhelum and Lahore, for example. So when I went to community centres, I usually began with doing group interviews in Oldham, mostly because I wanted to make sure that, you know, the women were sort of aware of what the process would entail, and I would, you know, go back and interview women individually. So when I was doing that, there were people who weren't from Middlesbrough who wanted to share their testimony, and that was completely fine by me. I was really interested to hear their thoughts. And there was one woman in particular who made a distinction between her experiences as someone who grew up in Lahore and Middlesbrough women's experiences, or at least the idea and stereotype of what it means to be a woman from Kashmir. This idea that women from Kashmir were more likely to stay at home, that they were less likely to participate in, you know, types of work outside of either their home or their immediate community. And she insinuated that wasn't necessarily the case for women who were from her community, from the Lahori community, and the fact that she had spent more time in education compared to some of the women that she knew. So in that sense, the differences between different types of Pakistani women was made apparent then. In some ways, the difference in terms of religion or in terms of work experiences, for example, weren't necessarily made along lines that I expected. So a lot of women in Middlesbrough, for example, were very aware that women in Oldham, women in Lancashire had access to home working. So they would often be like, well, we can't work. We don't have the types of opportunities that women in Oldham, our family members in Oldham, have to do work from home and apply that skill in a context that means that they'd get paid, albeit very menial wages. So in that sense, women were drawing a comparison, but it was never along the lines of religion. I never had anyone say, oh, you know, a Hindu neighbor, for example, or someone from India has had a different experience to me. And I think that might be it might have been something in the design of the project, that I was really focusing on women's personal experiences, and that women often, Pakistani communities in both places seem to have congregated in very concentrated places. So it meant that the vast majority of the time they were communicating with and engaging with other Pakistani women. And there were very few instances of them saying that they had neighbours or friends who were Indian, Bangladeshi, white. That never came up very often. But when it did, it was very notable, specifically Pakistani women's relationship with white women, and how white women helped Pakistani women fill out family allowance forms, for example. But the examples are quite limited. Sorry, I rambled on, but I hope that answered your question.
Ah, yes, now they said in the chat, that's really useful. It may be a generational thing as well. Olivia said in the chat, thank you for this interesting presentation. I'm interested in the valuing of work and the way you're defining work in the research. I'd love to be able to read more. Do you have any publications or planned outputs where I can read more? And you might also, if there's anything else you want to say about, you said you talked about this a lot, but if there's anything else you kind of didn't say you'd like to add about how you're defining work, perhaps we could maybe.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of publication, I had an article that came out, I think it was a week ago, with Women's History Review. And in terms of developing this into a book, that's something I'm very aware of, and now have the time to really think about. And I guess it speaks to a growing body of really exciting scholarship to do with migrant women and their everyday experiences. And I would love to contribute to that body of scholarship that's emerging, that does have a long history, but there seems to be new and exciting work being added to it quite regularly. The second part of that question, defining work was a really long process for me. It took me a really long time to sort of gather my thoughts on what I believed work meant. I always knew, doing these interviews and even from my own personal experiences, that this definition of work that's related to the money economy and the ways in which migrant people's value is often determined by their ability to contribute to the economic growth of the country, a very dehumanizing way in which to, I guess, see someone who is migrant. I knew that that was something that needed to be challenged, and that whatever definition of work I put forward had to challenge this idea that essentially taking definitions of work that sort of borrow from the experiences of men usually, and using that to then try and encompass a range of work that women have always participated in. I think it became even more challenging when I guess conversations, the prominence of migrants coming to the UK and the dehumanizing ways in which they were being regarded, when those conversations they're still happening, being aware of that meant that I had to think even more carefully about the ways in which I was defining work. I was always aware of the fact that in defining work or in defining value by people's economic contribution, the ways in which South Asian migrants have been so since the 1960s, to say that women didn't work was then to question their belonging. And that's an incredibly dangerous territory to go into. So, in other words, migrants from Pakistan in the 1950s and 1960s came here to do the work white workers refused. So if you're saying that women didn't work, you're essentially saying that they are less valuable, that their belonging is being questioned, and that they are, the logical conclusion to that they're undeserving of their place in this society. But women demonstrated time and time again that they were doing really important things with their time. And it was work that really supported the growth of a community that has now become the third largest in the UK, the largest Muslim community in the UK as well. So in defining work, I really had to think about what the consequences of that definition would be. And the definition sort of came to me towards the end of developing my doctoral research. It was sort of like a light bulb moment that, you know, the application of skill will result in things that aren't always tangible, but it doesn't mean that they're of less value. So my definition had to encompass that yes, it can result in money, but it can also result in emotional support, in people finding some sort of moral value from teaching religion, for example. So it took many years actually to come to that definition, but it's one that I think about often, but I'm interested to see if it changes over the next few years as I expand on this research.
Really interesting. It's really interesting, you know, we kind of, it's all about work, like the wages housework movement and stuff, like in the, when was that, the 70s, 80s?
Yeah.
Something like that. But thinking about kind of the racialized, or the, you know, the implications for ethnicity and religion and all of those, like how those different definitions have different impacts on, like the intersectional versions of that, I think is really interesting. And how that might link to, like you said, migrant status and all of those, you know, the implications beyond just gender, I suppose.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, really interesting. We've maybe got time for one more question. Does anyone else want to come in? I can actually see someone typing. I maybe wanted to ask you, Aleena, about positionality.
Mm-hmm.
So you, right at the beginning, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. This is why it stood out. But like your own, you know, you said a lot of, you know, the virtue of how you got access to these communities because it was because of, you know, your own identity and having a way into these communities, essentially. I just wondered if you wanted to reflect a little more on that, maybe kind of what that gave you, and then there are kind of risks to that as well, I suppose, in lots of different ways.
Sure. I mean, as an oral historian, you think about positionality a lot. In what sense? Creating an interview is you're creating a primary source in real life, and that your position has so many implications of what that source will end up being. But any issues I saw with that, the supposed biases that come with interviewing people from your own community, for example, were completely outweighed by the fact that it felt necessary to do this research. So, as way of context, the initial idea for the research came in 2016 because of that conservative paper on integration that said that Pakistani women didn't work, and that means that they're not integrated. It seemed timely and relevant for me to do that research, despite the fact that there might be some challenges about the ways in which that affects the quality of the evidence that I was gathering. Being able to speak to women in their own language, for example, being able to access their homes, that was something that few academics before had the opportunity to do. So there are studies, for example, that I read on British South Asian communities, and there would always be a sentence of like, we couldn't interview women for this project because it was difficult to access them as men, for example, and we hope someone else will do this research. And it gets to the point, it's like, well, if no one else is going to do this research, then maybe I should do this research, or maybe, you know, someone who has a connection to the community should do this research. I mean, my positionality in more ways, I reflected on it more in terms of generational difference versus me being from the community. I think that had more consequences on the evidence that was produced afterwards. So a lot of women spent quite a lot of time explaining to me how they didn't have, you know, washing machines or, you know, dishwashers, and how they spent all day cleaning the coal on the floor. And they felt that important to tell me, assuming that I had no conceptualization of what 1960s Britain was like. And to be fair, I really didn't in terms of their experience. But in that sense, those were the type of memories women chose to share with me. So in looking at the evidence and looking at the testimony, that was a question I asked. Why were women choosing to tell me this in this context? And in what ways does me being younger, me, you know, being university educated, for example, how does that affect it versus us coming from similar communities?
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about, isn't it? I find all that fascinating in terms of the different power relations and how they're kind of always in flux, aren't they, depending on all of these different things. Yeah. So Shakti is the co-director of the Centre for Gender Studies, actually. Shakti is built on the comment about the wages for housework movement, social reproduction theory, and she's said it seems like your work can really add something intersectional and deeply ethnographic to that. Do you have any critical takes on that body of scholarship?
Critical takes. I mean, the movement for wages for housework, it was something I looked into, but in the end, it never really featured in my doctoral research very heavily, mostly because the women I spoke to rarely made the argument for them to be paid for their domestic work. So whilst I have, I guess, in some ways imposed my own definition of work onto one that they didn't necessarily agree with, as exemplified in my case study, they themselves never made the case of like, well, I did this housework, and you know, all the politics of the time related to the payment of housework, they never made reference to it. In fact, they never really made explicit reference to any form of politics, whether that be unionization, whether that be the expansion of welfare, for example. It was always incredibly implicit. So I think if I was going to expand this research, that would definitely be something I would look into. And I think it might be the consequence of just expanding the types of people I was speaking to. Again, the COVID-19 pandemic really affected how many interviews I could get. And whilst the interviews I had were incredibly rich, I recognized that there were gaps and answers I won't get, but questions that I won't get the answers to. Some of the women I interviewed, for example, have passed away since we did the interviews during the pandemic. So the idea of going back to them and asking them these types of questions, really important questions about the ways in which their experiences connect to other political movements happening in 60s and 70s Britain, that is something that will have to be the next stage of this research. So sorry, I don't have a great answer for that, but it's a really important thing to think about.
No, I think it was a good answer, and it's, you know, it's another interesting thing of how that pandemic context affected research.
Absolutely.
Particularly when it's like how, like a thesis, it's time limited, isn't it? You can't wait 10 years to do your interview.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're out of time. So thank you so much, Aleena. That was so interesting. I think you can tell from the comments that everyone's really fascinated. And there's so many layers, like you said. I think there's much more that we could unpick as well if we had more time. So thank you for taking the time. And thank you everyone for coming, for great questions. And do come along if you're free for our next seminar. And there should be some more next term as well, which we'll announce when they're ready. So thank you everybody, and thank you again, Aleena.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.